Well, good evening, or good afternoon, as the case may be. My name is John Fitzgerald, and I'm speaking to you as a veteran of the Vietnam War. And what I would like to do is just talk about how I became a veteran and what my experience as a veteran was, and then what I did after that period of my life. I was born in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and graduated from Holyoke High School. I also had graduated from the University of Massachusetts back in 1963. I was in graduate school in the fall of '63, and that was at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy. That, along with some other personal issues, made me feel I was wasting my time in graduate school, and I had a military commitment to take care of because they had the draft in those days. And if I left school, I would lose my 2S rating. So to make a long story short, I went down and talked about what my options were. And I was persuaded that I should go into the Army, and they talked me into going into officer candidate school. My only goal at the time was to perhaps go to Europe and do my service and get to see a different part of the world from Holyoke, Massachusetts. But having made the commitment to go to officer candidate school, I could no longer choose the area that I would serve in. Well, I went through Fort Dix basic training. After 8 weeks there, officer candidate school was 6 months. I did that at Fort Benning, Georgia, and that's down in Columbus, Georgia. And for the most part, it was July, August, and September, very warm time period. And we graduated in December. I then found out my assignment was going to be U.S. Army, Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska, with the Yukon Command. I arrived up there in January of 1965, and I was a young second lieutenant in the U.S. Army Infantry, and I was a combat infantry platoon leader. The military occupational specialty for that, I think, is 113, but that's off the top of my head. Infantry platoon leader is in charge of about 43 men, and that's broken down into 4 squads, and basically is the combat and maneuver branch for the U.S. Army, on the ground, or as they say, straight leg. In Alaska, we were equipped with armored personnel carriers, so we were a mobile force, but still infantry. I served up there for from January of '65 until December, early January of '66, and we did such things as work on winter operations, learned how to ski, how to snowshoe, and was doing some work on the ski fire team. We're getting ready to try out for it. When the word came in December of '65 that we were going to consolidate the unit I was with, we were 1st Battalion of the 47th Infantry. That's a battalion, it's about 800, 900 men. And that was going to be consolidated with the 4th Battalion, 9th Infantry to make one full battalion. You should know as a background that Army units in Alaska were not at full strength. We were about DEFCON 3, that's Defense Condition Readiness 3, which is very low, primarily because there really wasn't that much danger of an attack in Alaska, but nonetheless the Army was up there. So we were consolidated into one full battalion. My men were assigned to go. Anyone who had enough time to spend a year in Vietnam was assigned to this. And the question came, well, who was going to go with them? And I felt an obligation to join. So I joined the Army. I also joined or volunteered to go to Vietnam. We met up with another unit from Fort Richardson in the southern part of Alaska, got on a troop ship, old-fashioned troop ship, the Eltinge, and sailed out of Seward Peninsula area and went to Hawaii. We were about 2.5 weeks at sea and arrived in Oahu, Hawaii, and set up as a unit of the 25th Infantry Division. The 25th Infantry Division had already been sent over to Vietnam, and we were the 3rd Brigade. We're actually, technically it was the 1st Brigade, but we were the number 1, 2, we were the 3 unit to be put together. And as soon as we were at full strength and had some training, we were going to be sent over. The training was required because the unit I was with had been trained for Alaskan winter combat, and they wanted us to practice small unit tactics. We did not train as a helicopter unit. We trained as a ground unit primarily. We again sailed from the island of Oahu, Hawaii. We were stationed, by the way, at Schofield Barracks, and you could see the bullets in the walls there from the Japanese attack at Pearl Harbor. And of course, the island of Oahu is filled with United States military installations, along with Pearl Harbor and Schofield Barracks. There's several Marine stations and Air Force bases. Well, we sailed, I think it was on board the Walker, another troop ship, and about 2 weeks at sea, we arrived in Vung Tau Harbor in the Republic of Vietnam. And we pulled in there because we had crossed the international date line. I'm always vague about whether it was still April or early May when we arrived, but it was about that. And one thing you should understand also is the unit I went to Vietnam with was a unit made up of people I knew from Alaska and from Hawaii. That was not the experience of a large number of officers going to Vietnam, or for most soldiers assigned to duty there. They were placed on an aircraft and flown over, and then after a few days in country assigned on a 1 or 2 kind of basis to any unit that had need of personnel. Okay, so we arrived in country in early May. Our base camp for the 25th Infantry Division was set up near the small village of Cu Chi, C-U-C-H-I, and that was about 20 miles northwest of Saigon on Route 1. And we were about 20-25 miles away from the Cambodian border. The reason we were placed there was because that was an area of strength for the National Liberation Front, or as American commentators call it, the Viet Cong. Viet Cong means Vietnam Communists, and was shortened to an expression like VC. Their name for themselves was the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. Okay. Well, at the base camp in Cu Chi, our duties there consisted of a 3-day rotation. One day would be guarding the bunker line, the perimeter of the base. Another would be guarding an area where engineers were extracting some road building material, a laterite pit, and they needed protection against snipers. And then a 3rd day we'd be on patrol around the base. And periodically they would ask us to go on extended missions, and that's when we first got introduced to flying in helicopters. They carry us out, about 10 men per helicopter, to our area of operation. I was in Vietnam for about 2 months, but I think I worked it out to 56 days. And the last operation I was involved with was the one that got me wounded and was the first really intense firefight. Outside the base, we were getting sniper fire. And what happened was the Air Force convinced the Army people that they could knock out this suspected sniper location, which was based in a small pagoda, and they were going to bomb it with surgical strikes, as they said. Well, they proceeded to drop bombs on this small pagoda, and not one of the bombs hit it. Several bombs did not go off, and a few blew up trees. And I still remember vividly watching a tree rise vertically, go up, straight up, and then come straight back down. Well, because of the Air Force's action, or their failure to carry out that mission, there were now a couple of 100-pound bombs out there in the hands of the National Liberation Front. They could take the fuse assembly off the front of that and wire the bomb for a command detonation and put it in the road and wait for a tank or an American truck to drive over it and then blow it up. So I was assigned to go out and try and find the sniper and also to detonate these 100-pound bombs. And so we went out on the 25th of June at night and moved across the stream and set up a line that, for search and find, and proceeded to sweep the area looking for the unexploded bombs and also see if we could locate the sniper. The sniper found us and was firing away. It didn't hit anybody, but the bullets were going overhead. You could hear them zipping by. And we found one of the bombs and detonated that in place. And we were in the process of looking for others when it was getting a little late in the afternoon. It was around 3 o'clock at this time, so we were supposed to cut off the mission by dark. And what happened was I had covered half the area, so I sent 3 units out, and I won't complicate it too much, but one of the units went out and somehow managed to go past the sniper's position unobserved and then swing around, and they came in behind the sniper. They then saw the man with the rifle and engaged him, and he fell. They called me, and I remember warning, watch out, there's probably more than one out there. And then the next thing I heard, the woods erupted with a lot of firing. And what had happened was they had ambushed the sniper, but then as they moved in to check out the remains of this sniper, the others ambushed them. So I took a unit, and I had about a squad left. And we went out to rescue our group from the enemy fire. And we pulled that off, and in the course of that, I got wounded, and a few other men got wounded, and one man was killed. The man who had shot the sniper was in turn killed by enemy fire. His name was Charles Brown. I later found out that he was born on the 4th of July, 1943. And his name is on the wall. That's the first name that I looked for when I went to visit the wall, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall in Washington. Okay, so I got wounded. It fractured my right arm in the humerus. And I remember the sensation I felt was I was glad I was hit, because I just, quote, knew, unquote, that I was out of there. And there was no other place on earth that I wanted to be more out of than Vietnam. And sure enough, when I got back to our assembly area, they had already dusted off, or dust off is the expression they use for medevac helicopters. They'd taken out some of the wounded men. And so I rode out with the remains of Charles Brown, and took us to the base, 25th Infantry Division base emergency hospital. And I looked down, and all I could see in my arm was a small hole, but the exit wound was really horrendous, coming out my back. It had broken the arm, and I was losing a bit of blood. So they said that I needed more advanced surgery, so they put me in a helicopter. And I remember the dryness of not having any water, and they said, well, you can't drink any water, you're going to be under surgery in about 15 minutes. So I had another helicopter ride to, I believe it was the 3rd Surgical Hospital, and that's where they did the emergency repairs on my arm. And when I regained consciousness there, it was just sort of surreal experience, this huge hospital ward with about 30 people in it in various stages of wounded, along with sadly, some Vietnamese civilians who had been caught literally in the crossfire or had detonated various booby traps or whatever. Next stage in my service then was they keep you there and stabilize you, and then we were flown off to Japan. So I landed at an air base in Japan, and we were transferred to Yokohama, the Kashini Barracks Hospital in Yokohama, Japan. And I had some more surgery there, and that's where I began to read up on the origins and history of the American involvement in Vietnam. And that's been a continuing course of study for myself ever since. My arm was declared to be a non-union fracture, but the first thing they wanted to do was make sure the gunshot wound was repaired. And so I got wounded on the 26th of June, had surgery in July, and I was flown out of Japan in September of '66. Came back to Fort Devens. The wound had healed completely and thoroughly. I did not have much loss except my right arm's a little bit shorter by about 1.5 inches, 2 inches than my left arm because it just shattered the bone. And I walked around in a cast waiting for the fracture to heal, but I had that on, and my arm was kept in an elevated position like this so that it would heal or knit. And it didn't. So in May of '67, I had my last surgery on the arm, and a pin was inserted, and they did a bone graft, and that worked. So I was out of the cast and had basically almost full use of my right arm. I've lost some motion in it, and there's some bursitis, etc. Okay, but for the most part, I was a very lucky man to have been wounded in that way, because it did get me out of there, and I was happy about that. I'll add, as just a kind of a sidebar, I was awarded the Purple Heart, the National Defense Medal, and I was in combat in an infantry unit for more than 30 days in a combat zone, so that qualifies you for a combat infantry badge. And that's rather prized among infantry soldiers. I also was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor for what I thought was basically just doing my job that day. If an element of your platoon is under attack while you're on a mission, of course you're going to go out and help them out and complete the mission, but also get them out of the difficulty they were in. But that was considered meritorious enough, so I was awarded the Bronze Star for Valor. Back at home, they had said, well, while we're waiting for the arm to heal, you can have some medical leave. And I said, well, I'd like to go back to school. And I went back to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and in graduate school in political science. And since I was walking around with this distinctive cast on my arm, I was easily identified as a Vietnam veteran. I want to just state for the record that the reception I got was a very warm and welcome one. I did not encounter any antagonism. I did encounter people who had questions. This is now, of course, remember early '67, January, February of '67. Questions about what the war is like, what's going on. And when I confessed that I had some serious questions about it as well, this made for genuine dialogue. I began reading quite a bit about the roots of American involvement in the Far East, and specifically the role of the French in Indochina, which is basically a colonial imperial relationship, with the French believing they had the right to control the people of Indochina, as well as the resources and the wealth that those resources could produce. And the more I learned about this, the more I felt that it was not really worth the cost in human life, human suffering. One of the basic ethical maxims that I learned in an ethics class is that you should not prolong unnecessary suffering. And the people of Vietnam were caught in the middle of these forces, and it was basically an argument about politics and economics, and perhaps that's a good argument why human life should not be shed over it, because it's really a matter of public opinion and political opinion. Nonetheless, I came to see that the anti-war side of the debate had the stronger case, and I began to loan my support to that. I first defended the right of dissidents and people who were dissenters on the war to speak, and then as I was reading more and more about the anti-war movement, the more I came to believe that, well, this shouldn't just be a discussion as if it was some sort of activity in a salon somewhere. This was American public policy and was something that had to be injected into the political arena. And sure enough, in 1967, Senator McCarthy, Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, announced that he was running for president and he was going to oppose Lyndon Johnson's war policy. I got involved with that and went up to New Hampshire, did some work up there, worked here in Massachusetts, and I was elected as a McCarthy delegate to the Democratic National Convention of '68, and I represented the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts in that presidential primary of April of 1968. So I was able to vote at the Chicago Convention. Most people remember the Chicago Convention as a riotous assembly, a lot of contention. There were some serious debates conducted there, questions about whether an all-white delegation, for example, from Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, should be claimed to represent the Democratic Party in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. When in fact, this is the day and age of integration and civil rights struggle. The only folks who voted for Lyndon Johnson in '64 in those three states were largely African American citizens, along with a few progressive whites. And so that was a major fight, alongside this major fight about the peace platform. And the House divided, and most of the delegates to a national convention in those days were appointed by the governors of states. They were pretty much the insiders of a political campaign for U.S. senators and governors. And there wasn't too much participation by rank and file members. There might be some union people there, but essentially the sort of people who went to national conventions are the people who played the game of politics over the years. They're the veterans. And they usually don't stand for very much except the privileges that the inner circle and power requests. We were, of course, part of the challenging group, and we were trying to raise issues and get them to debate the question of whether the United States belonged in Vietnam. At this point in time, of course, Martin Luther King had spoken out against the war, and he had been killed in the spring of '68. Robert Kennedy had spoken out against the war, and he was assassinated in June of '68. So there was clearly a division in the United States about the wisdom of our war policy and what it was doing to us here at home, how it was affecting spending for domestic projects, and what it was doing in terms of neglecting the real needs of the inner city population. And maybe most of us thought that perhaps before we lectured the Vietnamese on how they ought to run their political affairs, that we in the United States should get our own house in order and take care of our own priorities, our own real priorities, our own people. Well, anyway, McCarthy did not win the nomination. Hubert Humphrey did. He went on to lose to Richard Nixon by a very narrow margin, and the war continued. I continued to speak out against it, and I finished off my political science courses, but I never finished my thesis in political science. And I was involved with the McGovern campaign of '72, did some work in the October moratorium. I was a member of a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and that was a group of those of us who had served in Vietnam who spoke out against the policy and defended on the grounds that it's your patriotic duty to support your country by pointing out its faults as well as its good points. To be a critic is not necessarily to be negative. A critic is also very helpful to someone who's off course. And that was how we interpreted patriotism. And we defended the rights of those who were not soldiers to offer their opinions on American foreign policy and military policy, which of course is everyone's right as a citizen of the United States, to have an opinion and to voice it and to discuss it with your neighbors. So that's what Vietnam Veterans Against the War meant to me, and that was the role I played. By 1973, the war was beginning to wind down. I began teaching here at Long Meadow High School in 1971. And when the war finally ended in 1975, I had made a pretty strong commitment to being a public school teacher, specifically in the social studies, and I had gravitated more towards history. I think to this day, history is the most important of the social studies. I don't know how anyone can call himself educated who lacks a basic understanding of American history and world history. And that's one of the things that I've been promoting here as a teacher. In 1978, I was awarded a Master of Arts in Teaching degree from the University of Massachusetts. And I've been carrying on my political work. I haven't really lost the ideals and values of the 1960s. I think there were perhaps some excesses in that time period, but in general, the decade of the 1960s was a positive one, a progressive one. We saw the growth not only of the civil rights movement and the advancement of voting rights, housing rights for minorities, actually for all of us. Civil rights and civil liberties don't just apply to racial and ethnic minorities, they apply to all citizens. But we saw the growth of that movement thanks to the work of people like Martin Luther King. And we also saw the growth of the women's movement, guaranteeing full equality to 52% of the population. And I think that's a positive good. The environmental movement also developed during this time period, and it's an ongoing struggle, as are all the movements, frankly. But that's, to me, the major legacy of the 1960s. And so to more or less wrap this up, I started off talking about my career as a veteran, as a soldier, but because of those choices, I wound up with a rather exceptional experience. It gave me an opportunity to speak out and speak to other citizens that perhaps I would not have had if I had not been a veteran. So though I think our policy in Vietnam was foolish, and in turn, and in time, that was the judgment of history, because the American people basically turned against the war and said that we were not going to carry on that policy. But it was a long struggle. Even though that was my starting point, I think it's given me a perspective on things that, well, I don't know if I could exchange it for anything else. It's helped make me what I am today. And I don't think we need wars to develop that kind of perspective. I would encourage people to look for nonviolent approaches to solving political, economic, social, educational problems. And there are almost always alternatives to violence. And we preach that in our schools, and I think perhaps we should preach it in the halls of Congress and in the halls of the United Nations. So I guess that about sums up what I would like to have as a testimony to my career as a veteran here in the United States of America. Thank you very much.